Okay. So my name is Brunilda Kondi. I'm joining in from Albania today. I've been with the Society since 2015, and my interest in Emily Dickinson is teaching her poetry to college students in Albania, but also as a reader for relatability and for therapy. So the translation community events Transport contained, actually the idea goes back to December last year in having a translation workshop that would be continuous for the community's events in the EDIS. And so far there have been a few, with the first one being in February, where the group translated of Yellow Was the Outer Sky. There's actually a public piece in the EDIS bulletin about that, with a few translations in Mandarin, in Turkish, in Spanish, Portuguese.
Why?
Then in the second one, there were a few translations of the poem, The One That Could Repeat the Summer Day. And after that, the group kind of opted into going into the master letters or master documents, and we've only translated the first of those. And now we're restarting the series with this new workshop today. Axel will say a few words about it.
Yes, hello everyone again. For those who don't know me, I'm Axel. I'm originally from Turkey, but I've been living in France since 2018. I'm currently affiliated with the University of Edinburgh as a visiting scholar, working on comparative philosophy. My approach to Dickinson comes from that interdisciplinary background, especially from 20th century European philosophy like phenomenology and hermeneutics. I'm interested in how Dickinson's poetry opens questions of being, place, and language, and how Dickinson allows us to experience thought through language, through poetic language. And I'm really humbled and happy to be co-hosting this year's series with Bruna. So I would like to just briefly mention a few changes we've made to the format this year. The first one is the name. So we now call it Translation and Interpretation Series. Not only translation is always based on interpretation, but as Heidegger would say, every interpretation is a translation. Translation is never about just moving words from one language to another. It's always about trying to let the poem speak with its own voice in other languages. And what interests us is to be able to bring those languages into conversation with one another, And that naturally leads to the second change we made, which is the introduction of guest speakers. Each session will now welcome a guest who chooses one of their favorite Dickinson poems for us to be able to explore these poems or this poem together. And I'll let Bruna welcome our guest for this session.
Yeah, I don't think Cristanne Miller needs an introduction, but we're really delighted to have Dr. Chris here with us. The introduction will actually focus on is more in the context of the EDIS as a founding member and former president of EDIS, and most importantly, as a recipient of this year's EDIS Lifetime Achievement Award. And I was showing earlier the famous book, A Poet's Grammar, the author of which he is, and with the greatest contribution of having all of the poems of Emily Dickinson as she collected them, and recently all the letters of Emily Dickinson, as well as a leading voice and mentor in the society. She has co-founded the Dickinson Critical Institute, organizing major conferences, and also helping create all this inclusive community. Thank you, Chris, for being here and for choosing the poem. The choice of the poem is the most difficult one. I should have mentioned the most important fact about the previous translation workshops. We had Antoine Cazé lead the workshop and choose the poems and guide us in the translation. I and Axel are now translators. We are humbly trying to bring these poems into our languages. So this will be more of a discussion of the challenges and what each of us were struggling with as we were trying to translate these poems into the languages that we'll be introducing here. So we will start with Chris reading the poem and guiding us through that. Then each of us will read our versions in our languages if we want to share what we were struggling with. And then we've also prepared some translation challenges. And then Chris maybe can ask us questions about certain things that you think are important, Chris, and how we handle them in our languages, whether we're transmitting them or not. And here's Perek. Perek, do you want to say a few words?
Hello, Perek.
I'm just very sorry for being late, but I just couldn't get in for some reason. I couldn't find the code, but I'm really sorry. I'm here. Thank you.
So I also want to thank Axel and Bruna very much for inviting me to participate. I'm extremely interested in translation, even though it's something I've never done with Dickinson's poetry. And one of the great joys of a Fulbright fellowship that I had in France for a semester was participating with Antoine Cazé in an ongoing translation workshop there among students and scholars in Paris working on translation in various ways. So Antoine wrote me this morning to send his regrets that he wasn't able to join us today. He had an unfortunate last-minute conflict. But I also thought I would announce to this group that Juan Calvillo, who is one of the founders of the original version of the workshop, as Axel described it, has just won the Mexican National Prize for Translation.
Wonderful.
So really a very, very big deal. And he's being interviewed all over the media there in Mexico. So that's a kind of lovely tribute to him, and also, point of interest for translating Dickinson. So I will read the poem, and I did make several notes about things that strike me as particularly interesting to think about when you're translating the poem. But I guess I'll wait until everyone has read their translations and we've heard them, and then maybe I'll respond. So I'll follow the order that I've forgotten whether it was you, Bruna, or you, Axel, that suggested. Anyway, so here's the poem, and I'll read it as she first wrote it into her fascicle. And then, if you don't mind, I'll read it a second time, adding in the alternatives that she wrote into, that she either interlineated or wrote at the bottom of the page for various words and lines. Okay, is that okay? All right, so the spider holds a silver ball in unperceived hands, and dancing softly to himself, his yarn of pearl unwinds. He plies from knot to knot in unsubstantial trade, supplants our tapestries with his in half the period. An hour to rear supreme his continents of light, then dangle from the housewife's broom, his boundaries forgot. Okay, so this is a poem where there are quite a few alternatives that she writes in, and they seem to me really interesting. So I'll read it now with the alternatives. The spider holds a silver ball in unperceived hands, and dancing softly to himself, and dancing softly as he knits, his yarn of pearl expends, or his coil of pearl unwinds or expends, or pursues his pearly strands. So that's a line she kept working on, right? He plies from knot to knot in unsubstantial trade, supplants our tapestries with his in half the period. An hour to rear supreme his continents of light, or his theories of light, then dangle from, or then perish by the housewife's broom, his boundaries forgot, or his sophistries forgot. So there it seems, if she replaces continents with theories, she also wants to replace boundaries with sophistries, right? So those are alternatives that seem to work together, whereas the others, I'm not sure if they work together or not, or they work in various ways and various patterns. So probably if you figured out how many poems you could come up with if you added each alternative in individually, it would be well over 100. So anyway, okay. I'm eager to hear the translations.
I put the wording of those together, so maybe I can share it in here. We don't have to go in alphabetical order, so whoever wants to start first, maybe Magda or Mark.
All right. Die Spinne hält einen Silberball in unbemerkten Händen, indem sie sacht sich selbst umtanzt, spult ab perlweißer Faden. Sie schwingt von nichts zu nichts. Ihr schwereloses Werk ersetzt durch ihren unseren Gobelin in der halben Frist. 1 Stunde zur Erschaffung ihres Kontinents aus Licht und baumelt dann vom Besen. Vergessen ihr Gebiet.
Thank you, Magda.
Okay.
Then we can go on with Indonesian, Mark. I really love the word spider in Indonesian.
Yes. Well, one thing I will mention before I start is that Indonesian translations are generally like 30–50% longer than English.
Mm.
So that was so wonderful to have the meter there, and you'll find that I didn't even. Laba-labanya pegang bolanya perak dengan tangan yang tidak bisa kami lihat dan menari untuk diri sendiri, benang mutiaranya diulur. Berlayar dari nol ke nol, perdagangan tanpa isi, menggantikan kain ikat dinding dengan ikat dia dalam waktu separuh. 1 jam bertakhta, para penuanya terang, lalu menjuntai dari sapu rumah tangga, perbatasannya terlupakan.
Thank you. Axel, do you want to go next?
Yes, sure. Well, there's already a difficulty for me. And in Turkish, there are no gender pronouns. So I can never say his or him or anything related to she or he. So the word that you see in parentheses, bey, is an addition, which is optional. But I wanted to include it there, which means sir or mister, which fits, I think, Dickinson's language, to be able to point out that this a male spider, and but I'm not sure if I should read it or not, but it's there, so you know what it is about. Örümcek gümüş bir top tutuyor görülmemiş ellerinde ve usulca dans ederken kendince inciden yumağını çözüyor. İşliyor bir boşluktan diğerine, cisimsiz bir alışverişte. Bizimkini gölgeliyor onun dokuması, kaşla göz arası. Bir saatte yükselttiği ışıktan kıtaları sallanıyor ev kadının süpürgesinden. Silinmiş sınırları.
Thank you, Axel. Actually, the gender was something that I also had to work with. In Albanian, we have morphological gender, and a spider is morphologically feminine. I did avoid it in my translation, so nobody can see the gender of the spider. Well, there's the morphological gender in the definite noun, merimanga, but then I removed all of the personal pronouns because they're not necessary in Albanian. So, merimanga mban lëmsh të argjend në duart pakapshme, teksa butësisht kërcen me veten, fillin e per la vesh pështjell. Për dridhet nga nyja në ny, me zanat të pabaz. Svendson si gjadet tona me dvetat në gjysmën e kohës. 1 orë për të ngritur në maj kontinentet e dritës, pastaj varet nga shkopi i zonjës, kufijt e vet harruar. I refer to the Miller version and I've put the versions in brackets. But what I realized today as Chris was reading those as different poems, then I like the idea of translating 100 poems with the versions in them.
We can maybe talk later about how differently they fit together, like if she's following up the knitting metaphor or following up the trading and international continents boundaries metaphor and so on.
Yeah. So we already mentioned the gender thing. Chris, do you want to, maybe ask your question?
Attention to one other thing. The gender thing is very interesting. And of course, the question in a way that you raised, Bruna, about whether the pronouns are even necessary is also interesting. How much difference does it make if the spider's male? But the thing that strikes me in English, and I'm wondering if you all thought about it when you were translating, is that there is a very bizarre syntactic move that Dickinson makes in the last stanza, right? So we get the spider holds, plies, supplants, and so on. And then in the last stanza, an hour to rear supreme his continents of light, then dangle. Right? It's not dangles.
Yeah.
So it no longer seems to be that. So what we have here is what, I years ago called an unrecoverable deletion, right? So the syntax cannot be recovered in any obvious way. But here are some possibilities that I thought of that might make sense of why she switches the tense in that last stanza, or at least doesn't define tense in that last stanza with dangle. So is it so he's doing all these things, active, an hour to rear supreme as continents of light, then dangle. Then does she kind of imply he shall dangle, he will dangle, right? So is that what leads to this, just dangle? Or is it that she implies he has an hour to rear supreme his continents of light, then dangle, right? So that would be another way to think about how dangle comes into this. But it's very mysterious, that dangle. And so out of curiosity, did any of you think about that as you were translating?
In that line, I was thinking about dangle and forgot also. Magda, do you want?
Yeah, of course. I thought about dangle quite a lot to find also a word that is sounds a bit like it, but also, well, the time, I think it is something that is always happening, something that is apart from time. So I think it's just a fact she states here after the hour work, that things just happen like that. They are gone, they are forgotten, they are over. And that happens with all beauty. Everything that is beautiful is fleeting. Especially, I think, Dickinson's idea of beauty, that things that are not disappearing are not beautiful. So this is what it didn't really. I didn't find it a problem, but I think it is general her idea of the fleetingness of things, of beauty, of flowers and anything that just disappears.
And I thought about it in the grammatical perspective, because in Albanian, the conjugation requires specific forms for each person.
I use the present tense.
The present, yeah. I use the
And in the
present
first
also.
line, I try to be as precise as possible. 1 hour for creation. 1 hour for creation. Kind of eine Stunde zur Erschaffung. 1 hour to make this. 1 hour making this. It is unpersonal.
Right, but in the third line of that stanza, Magda, you used the tense that corresponds to the spider acting, right? I've forgotten the word that you used.
That is right, but I did not think of the spider at that time, but I think it corresponds to this hour, to this making hour.
Yeah.
And in German, it is possible. It is unproblematic to use that because we are not very specific about using tenses. They're quite, say, completely different from the English language. So I think it was, it is understood in a way apart from the active creation.
I think
doing.
Emily wants to say something, so please.
Yes, Chris, I was curious that you don't see dangle as part of the infinitive. An hour to rear supreme, then to dangle.
Yeah, that's another possibility. So, but then there's still an implied active verb that's missing, right? So how does that sentence begin? He has an hour to rear supreme, then dangle, right? Or what else might it be? But I agree with you that dangle corresponds to rear. But rear seems to not to raise as many questions, at least in my head. An hour to rear, but yeah, you're right, absolutely right.
Well, if I may offer a translation or an interpretation English to English.
Yeah,
and if
please.
it's not appropriate to do that at this time, I'll step back. It feels to me in this poem that Dickinson's speaker has taken a step back to offer a commentary on the spider's art.
Yeah,
And
I think so.
As Magda said, the brevity, the fleetingness of beauty, and so that there is definitely a syntactic shift.
Yeah,
but it feels less a narrative about the spider than here is the moral of the story, or the observation to be drawn.
because the first line also is a shift already. So an hour to rear supreme, that the activity is past. So now is another idea about things created, things made.
May I make a comment from my language?
Yeah, please do.
First, there's no gender in this at all. In Indonesian, it's a he, she, it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no indication at all, nor would I try to force it. But you'll love the fact that in Indonesian there are no tenses.
Ah, lovely.
So in order to express time, you have to have auxiliary words. So it's funny because I just reread the poem in that view, and only in the last stanza is there any time at all. So lalu, then is the only relative time expressed in the poem. So the time, it's interesting to listen to you talk about it because, of course, it comes comes out quite differently in the poem if I read it differently, you know, in a timeless way rather than, you know, in the frame that I had when I was translating it. You know, I have a certain frame, but of course, coming to it without that frame, there's no time reference until the very end.
Except in the first two stanzas, the time is continuous, right? You see what he is doing, right? So progressive verbs, and but you're absolutely right, Mark, that it's not until the last stanza that you get the sequential indicator. First this, then that, as opposed to, you know, what he is doing in some kind of continuous way. I was speaking yesterday with a Brazilian woman who said in Portuguese, instead of saying spider's web, you say spider's house. I thought that think about this poem. So that what the spider is creating is, you know, his or her house, its house. But yeah, very interesting.
In that comment, I was talking to an American yesterday about her reading of it as a native speaker, and she was talking about the word ball. In Albanian, we have a specific word for a ball of yarn, so that's the word I'm using. I don't need to go to the word, like general word ball for that.
Well, I could also, in German, I could say Knäuel, because this is the wool, yeah. So they are different, but I always try to use the short words. Knäuel would be better, more precise, I think, in this case. But to be in her melody, I used ball, silver ball. Yeah, I was thinking for a long time about unperceived, shift of topic if you don't mind. This unperceived, what is unperceived for you, for an American, for a native speaker? Unperceived, has that to do with seeing? Should I say not seen or not realized? Not. So I was a bit puzzling about that, and still not satisfied with my choice.
I want to go back to the question about ball and yarn, because it's clear that she's also playing with this in her alternatives, where she at one point changes yarn to coil. Right, his coil of pearl, and then instead of unwinds, which is what a ball of yarn would do, expends. So it, you know, she kind of changes it to something that like comes from inside almost, or that requires energy to express rather than knitting, right? So on the one hand, she changes dancing softly to himself to as he knits, right? So so some of the words really push that notion of the spider as a knitter, in which case unperceived hands, right? Knitting requires hands, right? And the hands can't be seen, they're unperceived, because in fact spider doesn't have any hands. But, you know, in following her metaphor, the hands are unperceived. But then, you know, then she goes the other way, holds a silver ball in unperceived hands and dancing softly to himself, his coil of pearl expends, right? So it's there's a very different, or then she just throws it completely up in the air, pursues his pearly strands, right? You know, it's, for me, I don't like it as much, right? Pursues, that doesn't seem to me consistent with other stuff that she's doing, but you know, who am I? Anyway, these are, I also want to say, these are clearly not alternatives that she chose to replace her original words with. Because when she does that, she crosses out the original, or she underlines the alternative to indicate that she prefers it. And she doesn't do that with any of these words. Right? So they're kind of in play in the margin, but it's not like she's made a decision to replace anything. So I think all of you were making the right decision in going with the, let's say, the central poem and translating. Axel, a long time ago, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah, I remember. I was going to ask Mark, since he said that, well, in Indonesian, there is no gender. And I was just wondering whether you think it doesn't really matter whether we really define the sex of the spider or not, given the fact that actually in the two first stanzas, it's a male who and his destruction comes about by the broom of a housewife. And I was wondering whether there's a gender, there's an explicit gender dimension of this poem that Dickinson has in mind. And I was also thinking
Good
about
point.
whether we should also relate that with a sort of a theological interpretation. Whether, I mean, the creation of the spider web is an artistic creation, and I was wondering whether Dickinson was thinking about God in a sort of way as the spider, and then and his destruction comes about by something really mundane, something really everyday. And it's just a housewife's broom can destroy everything that's been made by the poet or the artist or the creator, whatever that is. So I was wondering whether you think that gender dimension is not really important, because in Turkish, if I say just örümcek, which is the word for spider, then I would never be able to mention the third line himself, or the third line of the second stanza with his. So it would never matter. And I was just wondering what you think about that.
Well, you know, I'm reminded of something that happened when I was living in Indonesia, and I had problem with my electrical system. And I called a friend of mine who stuck his head up and he said, "This looks like a job for an amateur. I'm a professional and I won't touch it." So I'm saying I didn't get to that high level to actually make that decision. In order to have specified gender, then I would have had to have added words, and I was trying to reduce the number of words as much as I could. I think that is important, and it's not in my translation.
And Bruna, what did you do? Because in a way, your situation was even more difficult since the spider is morphologically feminine.
Yeah, I was worried about the gender reading of the poem, because there is the housewife's broom in there, and there's a choice in making the spider masculine. I mean, maybe up until that time, I'd never thought about the spider would be masculine in any language, but I preserved the feminine in the word spider, which is morphological. What I could do, if we agree tonight that there's a gender dimension in there, I could play around with the words that have both genders and turn it morphologically masculine. That would be playful from the very beginning, though. The first mood that it will create, if I turn merimanga into merimangu, it will be seen as a choice to make it masculine, because this spider needs to be a masculine one for it to make sense in this poem. But I preserved the morphological gender feminine, removed the pronouns. That's the only cautious move that I made towards gender.
So
how did that work then for like the line supplants our tapestries with his? So what did you do if you have no pronoun there?
Yeah, we have a reflexive pronoun, which is the own one. So I went for the reflexive, which is neutral.
If I would change it, I could, and probably I would change die Spinne to eine Spinne, to indefinite. So that can be any, because Spinne in German is always female. I don't know why. So you could say, I could then change the whole thing and say one spider, just any one spider, eine Spinne.
But eine is also feminine. So you're also indicating feminine with eine.
But eine Spinne means all, and then I can later change to his and indicate by that that's a male. And I
Don't you think it would then be confusing because people wouldn't know?
Yes, it should be confusing, and I think that you can justify this confusion. I would just, it makes you think. And I think it's a very good idea with the creator, God, the creator, and the mundane person destroying it. So we should, this confusion would be, makes you think positively, I think.
Well, another confusion that I found in the poem is the first line of the second stanza. It applies from not to not, and we talked about that with Bruno, and I'm sure Chris has thought about it as well. I mean, there are so many possibilities of reading not to not. I mean, Bruno mentioned not to not in the sense of the textuality, and also I was thinking whether Dickinson was thinking of not with A, not with O. Did she want us to hear? He applies from not, as in naughty. I was just wondering whether she wanted to hear something like that as well. It was just an idea that I had, because it's possible to hear it that way at least, but I don't know what you think about it.
When I was talking to Axel about it yesterday, the first reading of the poem, I heard it as not with K-N-O-T.
Yeah.
And the needle spinning, whatever, knitting, and that's what I did in my version. I don't know if it's crazy or not. But in all the languages that I checked, and what I see in the versions here, it's a reference to nothing. So I don't know. I like not better, like the homophone, not the one in there.
But I again think of the creator God, and if you think of some creator up there, you can say he creates things. If you believe in it, he creates from nothing to nothing. So
but I have a question for the native English speakers. Do you apply from something to something? Like, is that a syntactic structure that you would use?
It's very uncommon, right? You don't usually talk about someone plying from anything. It's a very unusual word and structure. But to say he plies from morning till night, or he plies from, there's no idiom that's very, I would say, Park, Elizabeth, Mark, Emily, what would you say? Or, others, George, doesn't strike me that this is a common idiom. So not to not is no more or less uncommon than morning till night, or something or other. But clearly, it seems to me, I can't hear naughty in there. It's it's more syllables, totally different word, and doesn't fit with me, for me, in what she's doing in the rest of the poem. But from 0 to 0, from nothing to nothing, it seems to me as the general direction. But it's unusual. And you think, okay, how does a spider make something? Well, it seems to start from nothing.
It's plying.
I think it's, I'm sorry, Magda.
Okay. The plying and etymology, what is behind this word? I cannot remember. I think I looked it up, but I can't remember now. If you, where does this verb originate from?
I mean, I have no idea where it originates from, but I mean, when I think of someone who's plying, I think of somebody who is working at something routinely, regularly, right? So, I mean, the connection that strikes me is this idea of plying in unsubstantial trade, because it's like somebody who is working at a trade, right? A carpenter, or somebody who is plying a trade, which is that's how, I have no sense of how to translate this, but for me, it resonates with this idea of working on something like writing, for example, routinely using nothing except one's own imagination. So you're applying that over time regularly, but it's unsubstantial in the sense that it It's created out of nothing.
Out of
and
nothing. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And I
Well,
agree with
here-
Thank
you,
you.
It
Elizabeth, that
seems
you
to come
hear the
from
notion of a
Latin, meaning
trade.
fold.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Bruna.
No, I checked up the etymology of ply, and it seems to come from Latin, plicare, to fold.
To fold. Mhm.
But also from
So-
Middle English to apply.
Apply.
Mhm.
I was looking at it here with the folding, but also there in this is the American Heritage. There are two separate it's a verb transitive, and then I guess a verb intransitive. To traverse or sail over regularly is one of the meanings.
This why I
Um,
used schwingt. Yeah, I remember now. Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
here-
And it is to perform or work diligently or regularly. So, I mean, to answer the first question, no, it is not a common usage. I mean, I think it is in some ways in a more bygone usage
Yeah.
in our language. But I think Dickinson has chosen a word that is definitely, no pun intended, applicable here. And as to ought, not, the word that comes to mind for me is ought, as in the usage in pain has an element of blank.
Yeah.
The feet mechanical go round of ground or air or ought. And often in explaining that to my students, I explain that ought, while it can mean must do something, is also something, is just a, if the word not means nothing, then ought is something. And if I'm remembering the origins of the word, it is in English, Park, help me out. It's ought. It's, it's something. And I may be completely, delirious or deluded in my recollection of that, but it does seem to me that the not to not is from nothing to nothing, and I hear in that an echo of her use of ought in After Great Pain.
if I can talk about how it sat with me, relating my Indonesian head, which Indonesia is a land of islands. The word for our country is our land and water. So relating it to Massachusetts maritime heritage, I would say ply is not an unusual word in the sense of plying the seven seas, traversing the seven seas. And from that, I would say berlayar dari nol ke nol. It just sounds completely right in Indonesian to fly from naught to naught. The image is there of going. It's just there's no question about, there's no there are questions about the meanings of many of these lines, and a couple that I can't really vouch for, but berlayar, to ply from naught to naught, seems a very it's a very homey kind of expression to use for an Indonesian.
I would like to pick up on that notion, Mark, of homey, to go back to Axel's question about the male spider as godlike. And I agree with you, Mark, Axel, that especially in that line, supplants our tapestries with his, right? Ending with the capital H, his, does sound sort of like, the reference to God. But the word plies it sounds more like a tradesman. And so there's which it would not be entirely out of the ordinary for Dickinson to imagine supreme being in that sense, right? He's a maker just like us, which is to say he's got a trade. But the poem is so, the first two stanzas are so much about what the spider is doing, right? So this is an active spider. He's working. And in that sense, it sounds very much like plying his trade. And he's just, he's going all the time. So not to not, from nothing to nothing, but also just, it's like all day long. So from, can this mean like from midnight to noon, not to not, from some 0 hour to another 0 hour, it's continuous. He's expending, unwinding, plying, supplanting, right? And then I was
and
also
yet his
thinking
trade is unsubstantial.
Yeah,
it's unsubstantial but supreme. So yeah.
So I think
Well, I
I will
think
change my translation and take the indefinite in the first line, indefinite article, and then this his sein, because it is very important. It is an important part, and in German you would understand, even if die Spinne seems female, everybody knows that there are probably different genders. So that I think a German would stumble shortly over it, but then understand. So I think I changed that.
Die Spinne is a great word. It reminds me of Schubert's Gretchen am Spinnrad, Gretchen at the spinning wheel, where Schubert's music is continuous and she's continuously spinning at the wheel.
Could we go back to the word unperceived? Magda brought that up.
Yeah.
In reading the poem rhythmically, it feels to me it would be pronounced unperceived.
Yeah. Right. And I stumbled in reading it, Emily, because the first time through I read it as unperceived, and the second time I read it as unperceived. It's one of those lovely moments in Dickinson where my inclination is to hear it, the line metrically, in which case it is definitely unperceived. But I wish we knew. Somebody has just contacted me about making an audiobook of Dickinson's poems. And I thought, oh gosh, how exciting that would be. And then I thought there are all these questions you have to determine, like unperceived and unperceived, in order to come up with readings in a book. But anyway, yeah.
Beyond the pronunciation, though, what are we to make of unperceived hands? The who is, in what way are they unperceived? Are they unperceived by the speaker, the narrator? Is this an unconscious action on the part of the spider?
I was thinking of that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that by whom
the
also.
description certainly is, the spider's unwinding the yarn, or let's be like Spider-Man zapping it out. But I get a sense of the spider kind of hunched over its yarn source or its coil, unwinding it, but we don't see the silver ball, or that maybe even the silver ball is being held in a way that we can't even see the ball itself.
Yeah.
Axel and I were talking about unperceived earlier. As we were looking at the Italian translation together, they had made a choice for unperceivable there. So that's how they translate in Italian.
Yeah, that would again point to the creator, to the I was thinking of nicht gewahrt, which means nobody took notice of it. So this unbemerkt is, I think, is too flat for me. I don't really like it.
Yeah, unbemerkt, yeah, sounds more like nobody happened to see it,
Yeah,
which seems not quite as strong as unperceived.
yeah,
Yeah, but unperceived is not exactly the same as unperceivable,
Yeah.
no.
right? So it could be seen. It suggests, but it hasn't been.
So this was exactly what we were talking about with Bruna. And Bruna, can you please show the Italian translation?
Yes.
Because in the Italian translation, it reads like unperceivable, and which I think is completely different from what Dickinson wants us to hear. There's something more temporal happening. It's never perceived until that moment. I think that this is different from that the possibility of being perceived. So then
whose translation is this, Bruna?
I found this on a website where they have translated all of them. They don't mention, or from what I've researched, they don't mention who translated it. They only mention there's all the poems translated, and they seem to refer to the Johnson version.
Yeah.
So about that, and I think people probably know this, there is because I think Juan Carlos mentioned this to me some time ago, that there is a complete version from the Johnson translation, or sorry, not translation, but from the Johnson edition of Dickinson's poems into Italian by, I think it's Stefano Essigrini. It's online. I have no idea. I discovered it when I started looking into Italian translations. This is not part of the massive translation that which is the one that was done in like 1991, the Mondadori edition. And then it apparently is going to be coming out in a new edition, I heard, sometime soon. That's the one to which Silvio Raffo contributed the largest number of translations, but includes also Eugenio Montale and a number of other well-known Italian translators.
So
I imagine, yes, I'm sorry.
Say again, Elizabeth, what's the translation that's about to come out? It combines various translators?
Yeah, as far as I know, and I can check on this, it's this one. It's I Meridiani. It was published by Mondadori, Tutte le Poesie.
Okay.
This is the one I have. But that's my understanding that that it should be coming out. Maybe it's a republication of the same version, but I can check on that and tell you for sure. But I do see what you're talking about in mani impercettibili, which means imperceivable.
Yeah.
So it's interesting too that this translator uses coil, theories, and sophistries. So it chooses some of the alternative words, but not all of them, right? So that's an interesting interpretive decision as well.
I don't know if I don't have the Johnson edition, so I couldn't check if it's from the Johnson's decisions. I'm not sure.
Yeah, let me check.
I had it, and this was from Johnson's edition, I'm pretty sure.
About unperceived, that seems to me to be a sensory description. You know, I had the choice of knowing about something, perceiving something that was not with respect to sensory perception, and I found that inappropriate.
Okay, let me just say this is not what Johnson prints.
Okay.
So Johnson prints the fascicle version as fascicle version, and then, like Johnson, lists alternatives at the end of the poem. So Johnson uses to himself, yarn, continents, boundaries, and so on. So this really is the translator's decision, whoever that person is.
I have another translation here by, and he says unmerklich, you know German. Unmerklich is not that you cannot perceive it, but it is somehow in the dark, in the secret. unmerklichen Händen. So there are other possibilities. It's, I think I like them very much, by Werner von Koppenfels. I also contacted him. Yeah, I think probably better than unbemerkt, unmerklich. Well,
Nabucco, have you translated this poem into Japanese?
No, I didn't translate it myself, but some of the another scholar translated it into Japanese. Yes.
And how did that scholar deal with some of these issues?
Yeah, maybe 雲は人目銀のボールをこの人に just a moment 雲は人目につかない両手 hands that are not seen is there yes understanding yeah so
Are
unperceivable
not seen, yeah.
not unseen.
When I was reading the poem, I was thinking about both unperceived and unsubstantial, and I was trying in Albanian to use the same prefix adjectives, so to go for the same, like to preserve the grammatical aspect that is in there. I don't know, like, what do you think about that, Chris? Would there be something, is it unperceived or imperceived? Like, I didn't check the dictionary if that's what the common prefix would be used to create the opposite in there.
Well, I think you're asking two questions, and I would answer them in slightly different ways. So, in translating, it seems to me to maintain rhythm in some sense, you often do want to follow the kind of syntax and the kind of grammatical choices that Dickinson uses, except it seems to me that for some words in some places in the stanza, that matters more or less, right? So, for example, just listening even to the languages that I didn't know, I was struck by how beautiful many of the last lines sounded, that his boundaries forgot, right? I mean, with that dash and then the last word, I could just hear it. I didn't know what the words meant, but it sounded like forgot. So there was something that was echoing, Dickinson's phrasing there that I thought was really marvelous. And so, right, maybe you want, for words like, she uses a lot of monosyllables at the ends of the lines here. So, hands, trade, light, ball. So, maybe those words you want to echo in some sense to capture, the sound of her poem. But and unperceived and insubstantial, so she loves multisyllabic words. But, to say instead, hands that are not seen, but I don't know, if it works better in the language, if it gives a clear sense of what she's doing, I would say, yeah, good, do it. Because a kind of slavish devotion to, following an English syntax, it seems to me, can get in the way of a good translation. By slavish, bad word, but, yeah.
I think it's
that's what mine means.
Yeah.
Mine means that you can't see it. But
yeah.
that was a choice against, as I said, another phrase which wouldn't have the sensory aspect. And I felt that the way she used it had a sensory aspect.
Yeah. And unperceived, yes, that sounds to me like you wouldn't say imperceived, you would say unperceived.
Yeah. And another thing we would have in the Albanian translation is the adjective comes after noun. So as you were talking about those small words at the end of the line, like
Yeah.
hence. Hence would be the beginning of the line in Albanian, just like we saw in the Italian version, the
Yeah.
unperceived would come after. We can do inversion for emphasis, but if we overdo it, then it loses the...
Yeah, and also this is a poem that's very easy to read, right? It's
Mm.
really lovely in its simplicity. And I would think you would also want to capture that in the language. You know, you're looking at this totally ordinary, you know, most people would say pest, but it's creating something quite lovely, insubstantial, you know, lasts, you know, only until it gets knocked down. Or blown away, you know, outside. Although, to tell you the truth, I'm shocked at how substantial some spider webs seem and how long they last, especially if they're outside. And Dickinson writes us, you know, this lovely dancing, you know, kind of creative portrait of what this spider is doing. And
that is Dickinson. He's doing that
well,
all
it
the
is
time.
Dickinson, but also you don't often think of a male artist as dancing softly, right? That, you know, so she's really
Creating beauty.
Yeah, it's just so I think that the things that you do in your own language to match that kind of simplicity and clarity as you go through, so that the, you know, the things that are puzzling are the metaphors, but not but not the, you know, not kind of like the overall portrait.
So sometimes you have to make this compromise. Compromise all the time to retain how she sings. And I do quite a few talks on Dickinson, and I always realize how people love the singing of her. So this is something that gets the people, and it really is fascinating how they come again and again to hear Dickinson. So I think it is important. Her melody is very important. She's a singer, and she, even in the crassest, in the most how shall I say, stark poems, she sings.
Go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
Pardon?
Emily wants to.
Okay.
Again, if we want to move on, I'll zip it. The notion of the spider as as God, particularly with his supplants our tapestries with his, is to me an interesting thing to think about. And it brings to mind Whitman's The Noiseless Patient Spider, in which Whitman then takes the example of the spider who's doing the exact opposite of Dickinson's spider and flinging forth filament, filament, filament out into the universe to find connection, which Whitman then connects to the soul. And the inverse is happening here. The spider is creating this gorgeous tapestry, which is to the housewife an irritation. And whether he perishes or dangles from the broom, I mean, there's that the boundaries forgot. It's to me, it's a very interesting way of reading both poems, but to think about that particular element. We may have finished with the God angle here, so I will subside.
No, I think we cannot quite finish, because there's this other spider poem of immortality. His strategy was physiognomy. So this immortal spider, the immortal web. So the creator shows himself in what he does. He's not seen himself, but he shows himself. And also the physiognomy of this, not only of the web, but also of the spider itself, is something with his long arms, as if he is holding the world in his hands. So I don't know
Which
she has
brings
so
to mind
a few
Eliot's
spiders.
web of connection.
Yeah.
Well, if we may, I want to go to the last line because I want to make sure that we have time to talk about that. His boundaries forgotten by whom?
So in saying forgotten, you're saying it's a past participle, right?
Well, that's a question.
Yeah.
So is it that he forgets his boundaries, or are they forgotten by the housewife? You know, so so he, you know, again, he has an hour to rear supreme, then dangle from the housewife's broom. His boundaries forgot. Okay, so that would suggest the spider has forgotten. His
This
own
is
boundaries.
one more
And
fantastic
if the
thing.
spider is creating theories, he's forgotten his own sophistries. But it could also be that the housewife then forgets the spider as soon as she knocks the web down.
Yeah, both is true, I think. I think this is the fantastic thing about Dickinson, that you have so many possibilities of interpreting. You can understand it on a very simple level, on a very direct level, but you can think about it endlessly, and you open up.
But the question for the translator is, in your translations, did you have to make a decision about that?
Yeah,
did you have to point in one way or the other?
And that's the problem.
That's a question that's really very interesting about that last stanza. You know, what
I was
make you do?
I was going to ask about that verb because I had to make a decision between past tense verb, he forgot, or past participle, forgotten. I went for the past participle. If I was given the space, I could argue that it's a way of saying he forgot as well, forgotten by him. I mean, there's ambiguity in there that could be covered in Albanian as well. So, but I had to think about that verb a lot.
Yeah.
And in Turkish, instead of using the more commonplace word to forget, I went for a word that means being erased or being swept, because it follows just the third line, dangle from the housewife's broom. So I thought that using only the word forget would be too bland, and it felt in French. I think I would use effacer if anybody is speaking French, because in the sense that it is forgotten. So what's being forgotten here, his boundaries. It's also the non-existence of that spider. It's disappearing. It's being erased. It's being swept away in a certain way. So I didn't want to only say being forgotten or forgot, but I wanted to really underline the fact that it's swept. It's effacé.
Perished.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
in one of the versions, it is perished, right?
Yeah.
No, the spider perishes. So then perish by the housewife's broom, his boundaries forgot. And so if you chose perish by, then it would have to be the housewife that's forgotten or that forgets, right? Because if the spider is dead, it goes without saying he's not remembering. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
So can I just make a case that the spider isn't dead, and that rather it's the web that is destroyed at the end?
That perishes?
The spider lives on, I think.
But you think that perish by, the alternative, can be referred to the web?
I've always thought the continents of light are the web, and so that's the thing that dangles, and that's the thing that perishes, and that's the thing that's gone. The spider lives, in my interpretation.
We hope so. Yeah.
What about the continents of light? I translated it, but I don't understand. Like, I don't see what they mean.
What if we put the word theories in there?
There's also theories.
So if it's theories, then the
it's even more
theories
puzzling.
perish.
Yes.
But
So I didn't think the spider
by the
died.
housewife's broom. and the sophistry, because sophistries is a very different word.
Yeah.
If you've got theories and sophistries, as opposed to continents and boundaries, or theories, or theories and even boundaries, that leads to a, as Chris said earlier, a very, very different reading of the spider's work. If
Yeah.
it's a sophistry, it's an unsubstantial trade and in a completely different sense.
Could someone explain in half the period? I don't
Yeah.
I don't understand what that
Yeah.
means.
I think that means in half the time that we make a tapestry,
But it's
right?
much
So
less than half
Yeah.
the time.
it's much
It
less
doesn't
than half
make
the time.
sense.
Right.
Mm.
He supplants our tapestries with his in half the period. That takes him half as long, right? In fact, it takes him a fraction as long. But yeah, I think that's
If we take period as as a long passage of time,
yeah.
And here I translated in Turkish this in half the period as kaşla göz arası, which is an interesting expression in Turkish, which literally means between the eyebrow and the eye, which means in such a small time.
Blink of an eye.
Yeah, a blink of an eye. Yeah, exactly. And it also gives the meaning of, I mean, every time I read the word period, I think of also the textual dot. So I was also thinking about that part. So the Turkish expression actually captures that in a certain way nicely, I think. Just between the eyebrow and the eye, like this little space, this betweenness, the half, I think, is captured there. So in Turkish, there's this nice possibility, I think.
How long does
had
the
the-
spider live?
Eric
Not
might
long.
know.
Sorry. Does anybody know the life of a spider?
Depends on the spider, but and the housewife.
Yeah.
At this time of year in where I am in North Carolina, there are huge webs that are woven by writing spiders, very large spiders. I think is that the kind of spider that's in Charlotte's Web?
I don't know, but it says, I just looked it up online. It says most common spiders live from 1 to 2 years.
Okay.
So,
So that's a lot longer than I would have thought.
a tapestry you can make perhaps in half your life. and so, no, I don't know.
I'm curious if I can just ask, and speaking not as a translator, but just, and a reader and interpreter. As translators, how do you make a decision as to whether to choose the variants or not? And I'm wondering this because as we've been talking, looking at words like coil, expends, right? If in fact we choose those words to open, that's as Chris and others have said, is such a different reading of this poem. Because then I could see, for me, I could see that coil, yarn being a story, coil being something like almost mechanical, but also having somewhat negative connotations, perhaps because of its association with the idea of something that uncoils, namely a snake, right? Something like that. To put that with something like theories and sophistries, to me, makes sense later. But how did you give any thought to how you would, choosing variants over some of the other choices that you had in front of you?
So maybe, Bruna, you could respond to that because you actually did translate the alternatives.
Yeah, the process I followed is I checked if the poem was translated first into Albanian, and there is one amateur version we have of a selection of poems, and he had translated that. I remember talking to him, and he did read the Italian translation, so he has followed the Franklin edition and followed the decisions that Franklin has made in the version. and then translate it into Albanian. I would say I'm happy that somebody like Chris made the decisions on what to put on what the poem looks like. And if I wanted to avoid all of these questions, what do I do with the versions? I could strictly stick to what is on the page in that version. What I did is I translated those, and I had to put a question that I wanted to raise here. What is the advice to the translator? Should the translator translate the versions? But as Chris was reading the different poems, I kind of got an answer. I guess you write different versions of the poem, make those choices, and then retranslate, putting those choices in. I don't know.
But it is an interesting question, isn't it? Because if you chose coil and expense, would that change anything else in your translation? Would it change the ways that you translate other words, right? Or,
I think it would. I haven't tried it. I'll try it, but I think it would. I can see how I would start reconsidering many of the choices then. Also.
Yeah. And this is something also I think about with continents and boundaries. So that, in some sense, this notion of trade. So it's like he plies his trade, namely spinning his web. But trade also suggests, a kind of, let's say, international or an activity that crosses other kinds of boundaries, right? So if we've got continents and boundaries and trade, it suggests that that the spider is, in some sense, covering or open to or dealing with larger territories than we usually imagine the tiny spider or even big spiders as doing. So, it's a great question, Elizabeth, that you asked, and Bruna, I was really happy to see that you dealt with the alternatives. At least a little bit, but as I said, she makes it very so. There is only one extant copy of this poem, just one copy, and so it's not that Franklin and Johnson are making decisions; they're following the central poem that she wrote in her fascicle, and all those other words are alternatives that are on the page but not chosen, not preferred. Right. And so they're there and they're really interesting. But she never at any point says, I prefer this to, what you first wrote or what is in the center of the page. And in fact, some of the alternatives, let's see, everything except coil and expands and as he knits. So the alternatives for the first stanza are interlineated, which usually means she wrote it later. Others are written at the foot of the poem, which usually means so she copies out the poem and then directly at the foot of the poem puts in her alternatives. But again, she never says there's no, even though it suggests that she's thinking about this poem at more than one point in time. She never indicates, cross that word out and put this one in. So it's interesting that the indication that this kind of stayed in her mind. I'm sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Would you mind giving me a moment to make a confession, and then you can prescribe my punishment? And I do this. I can make this confession only because you said that this would live on in a recording. And if another Indonesian speaker reads this, he might say to you, well, gosh, what's this? And that is the line about supplants our tapestries with his. Now, I only did this because I'm an amateur and this is a draft, but I couldn't resist. The line, as I said, it is menggantikan kain ikat dinding dengan ikat dia. And there's a kind of cloth, maybe you have some called ikat, which is a particular kind of Indonesian cloth that many people use as, I'm talking about, visitors to Indonesia get some and they use it as a wall hanging. So that's my tapestry. That makes more sense. But ikat is made by tying the threads together and dyeing it with by binding the bundles of thread, by tying. So I, not Emily Dickinson, exchanging his wall hanging ikat tying with his own tying. You see, I used the word ikat, which is appropriate to use for a web, a spider's web, because it ikat, mangikat his prey. So I just want to say that there's a little pun in there, a play on words that Emily Dickinson didn't have access to.
But which is culturally appropriate.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I suspect now, you know, my probably my longest or most important job has been as an interpreter in federal court. And you have to be exactly word for word. I mean, you know, meaning for meaning correct, because somebody could get convicted based on any excursions. So that's how I feel about this, is that it's probably unethical to put in this this play on words. But you can tell me how bad of an ethical violation it really is.
What Mark was pointing out to is, I had a question down that I wanted to raise in here about this cultural aspect into the translation. So in that case, Mark is choosing something that is appropriate in the culture in which the poem is coming, but there's also the housewife in here, more of a 19th century woman who's cleaning her own house, and you know, not that I had any struggle translating it into Albanian, but I was thinking about the cultural dimension as well. And I don't know who has the answers about what is done with the cultural aspects.
Many of us clean our own houses.
I actually just had a household broom, but that was really to eliminate the word, to say the woman's broom, household broom. You know, I just was trying to squeeze it down as much as possible because it was so much longer than the original. So I said, lalu menjuntai dari sapu rumah tangga, by the broom, by a household broom. It would be lalu menjuntai dari sapu ibu rumah tangga. So maybe that doesn't feel like such an addition, but was my choice, to make it to just say a household broom instead of the housewife's broom.
So I want to respond to what Emily or Elizabeth just wrote in the chat line. Again, just to clarify, so Elizabeth, were you looking in Franklin's one volume edition of the poems?
I think that's Emily.
Excuse me, Elizabeth, when you wrote, wasn't that you that wrote in the chat line that Franklin?
No, it was Emily.
Oh, excuse me, Emily, right. So
no, someone indicated that Franklin had rendered the poem differently.
No.
And that a
so
translator
Italian,
had worked from that.
But the Italian translation, yeah.
Right. So it was the choice of the translator to use the alternate.
Yeah. Not of Johnson or Franklin.
That, I mean, because Franklin's choices are in many ways arbitrary, because in the reader's edition he chooses the last chronological version
Whenever there's a fascicle version, that's what Franklin uses. So he doesn't use the last chronological version unless there's no fascicle version, I believe. I would have to go back and read his preface, but I believe that's what he does. And in this case, anyway, there's only one version. There's only one extant copy.
Yeah, we don't need to argue about Franklin's choices here.
Nah, so he wasn't making a choice. He was just going with the fascicle copy, which is the only copy. Yeah. Sorry, that was a totally unnecessary intervention on my part.
But of course, there are always these cultural differences and things difficult to understand. I think, therefore, it is really necessary, especially in Dickinson's case, to have always in readings or lectures the original, and then explain about the difference and about the unsatisfied and the not those choices you made, to explain how limited they are. Also, this wideness of the Dickinson, her enormous, the enormous possibility her poems offer. I think you always have to talk about that, and that that translation always limits. Yeah, it is never enough, never good enough.
Last year, we were discussing with Juan Carlos and Antoine the possibility of translating one poem in different ways, in just how many times in different ways you can translate one single poem, and then not only have Dickinson's different versions of different poems, but also have different translation editions of just single poem. That would be very interesting.
That's right. That also is
it would be very interesting to write an essay about that, in fact, and to say, what you're getting or what you're learning or what you're expressing with those different translations, which all come from the original, but do different work with it. Yeah. So isn't it Ezra Pound, help me, Axel, maybe you know this, who, when he's writing about translation, says that what matters in translation is that you write a good poem.
Yes, I think that's right.
It's not.
Remember, that made me translate for the first time. I read a translation of a Keats poem and I found it horrible. I didn't even understand it. It was word by word translation. And then I decided, no, this is impossible. Nobody will read that. Nobody will understand it. So I think that the song also is important. And this always... this is what makes, in the end, the choice. So I limited the housewife, which is, I'm sorry to say, but Besen, broom, is in German, I think, mostly connected with housewife, especially if spider and broom goes together, it is housewife. But of course, it's a shame that it is missing in the translation.
But the balance to that, Magda, is the musical quality, which you've already mentioned in Dickinson, and the ways in which your translation captures that musical quality, and the echo of the poem itself in English.
This is what my professor.
And that's not all translators have that option. I'm thinking about Richard Dillard's After Borges, which it was a deliberate choice of title, because to translate from Spanish into English is to lose a lot. And so the idea was to follow Pound's advice and to maintain to have a good poem for the English reader that captured at least some, if not all, of the Borges.
Yeah. So my professor once encouraged me and said, "You seem to hit her tones, her way of speaking." So I proceeded in that way. But of course, the compromises sometimes are painful. Yeah.
Right. Well, if you were doing something in French, you're going to have a problem with the fact that the word death is feminine.
The thing that
because I could not stop for death, she kindly stopped for me, isn't quite. the
Not
same.
quite what Dickinson wanted.
Well, how do we know what Dickinson wanted, Chris?
Well, she wrote his. He.
Sometimes I apologize.
Yes, she did.
But what makes her translation easier in German is the way that she doesn't connect sentences so well. So that makes it easier to change the line a bit between the dashes to something in front and so Shakespeare is far more difficult to translate for German, in German anyway.
We have had this discussion about the structure and the dashes and the words in between dashes in previous translations in here, because there are sometimes cases in languages where you need to change the word order, like the adjective, noun adjective in Albanian, for example, it's in reverse order than it is in English. And we've also talked, I think, a few times about what do you do with the dashes when you change that structure? Do you, take ownership and decide where the dashes go? Or do they follow the word wherever you're putting it instead of where they appear visually in her stanza? So that's been a discussion that we've had also.
It's always a topic, yeah, always. I've tried to retain as good as possible at the same, but of course, as the meaning changes slightly, or sometimes the word order changes, you have to find the proper space, and that takes a lot of thinking where to put it.
Okay, but I think excuse me, every translation that we looked at today, all of you isolated the final word of the last line. That is to say, it fell between dashes, exactly the way that Dickinson uses forgot. And I don't know what that final line was in every case, but it was isolated by dashes, which seemed to me, part of the loveliness of the rhythm of whatever you were reading. And typically, or rather, often Dickinson uses dashes at the end of a line. Which in a way simplifies that question, because if it's simply a dash at the end of the line, even if you've changed things in the middle of the line, then the dash is doing the same kind of work. And the only other word that she sort of isolates with two dashes also comes at the end of the line, but it's unwinds or expends. I don't remember if in the various translations, all of you also isolated that verb between dashes.
I did myself because
I did.
It felt right to do so.
And I went back to the previous translation in Albanian, and not only has he not preserved the last word isolated in dashes, he's also changed the word order of the last two lines. So forgot goes in the penultimate line, and in the end of the line is the housewife and the broom. But he's done it to create a good poem, I think, so that the poem sounds good in Albanian. That's what it seems like for me as a reader.
I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but in the first stanza, when she says, dancing softly to himself, his yarn of pearl unwinds, what's being unwinded is the spider and also the yarn of pearl. So because of that, it feels like she puts in double, she isolates unwind in dash. So and I think this is also the case in forgot. So this is why it's so difficult to translate forgot, and you don't know with which tense you will translate it. But so and unwinding is it really, it sounds really nice, especially it's in harmony with dancing softly to himself. But this is why I felt like in Turkish, as I said, it's unwinding. I don't know that there are so many. Unwinding in English actually is a difficult word to translate. I think there are so many ways of translating it, but it really felt like I had to put it in dashes because it feels like she wants to say something more with that verb specifically here. It's not just the yarn of pearl, but the entire situation itself is unwinding as well.
It says something passive. It just happens while she's dancing.
Yeah.
I had to think about that now that Magda is talking about passive. For that I would need a subject in Albanian, like he unwinds or it unwinds, and that would be two different decisions in Albanian because they wouldn't correspond. One would be active, one would be passive. I went for he unwinds because of the number of syllables, but I did think, what if it is not it unwinds, the yarn itself unwinds.
So Bruna, you went for saying that the spider unwinds as opposed to it,
the
ball
yarn,
of,
yeah.
so it would be he unwinds the ball of yarn.
Mhm.
Is that what you were saying? I mean, that's why
That's
would
what
be
that's how I read it.
He unwinds the ball of yarn, right? But Axel, you were suggesting that he unwinds himself in a way, right?
Yes.
And I said it unwinds.
Right. So it's less that who unwinds, but what's being unwound, right? Yeah.
And the advantage of Turkish here that I don't have, so the fact that we don't have gender now pronouns is a difficulty, but at the same time an advantage, because here I can just leave it open completely. So we don't know if it's it, he or she, which is unwinding. So there are all the possibilities there, depending on how the reader wants to interpret.
I'm sure
Although it seems to
it
be
unwinds.
But Axel, you're saying that it's always the spider that's doing the unwinding. So the question isn't who unwinds, but it's the direct object.
The yarn.
What's being unwound, right? Am I understanding correctly?
Yes.
So it's not whether he or it unwinds, but he unwinds what? He unwinds himself, or he unwinds the ball of yarn, right?
Yeah,
so it's not who does the action.
Yeah.
But what's being unwound? So it's a different grammatical issue.
Yeah, sure. That's another, sure.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that.
But does it have to be one or the other? Could it be both?
Yeah.
I mean, dancing is a form of unwinding.
There's something.
Not that I would know.
This is why I used the word a kind of spool,
I can't follow that. I'm sorry. I was just going to say there is something I hadn't noticed before, which is the idea that that somehow, I mean, is it that it's an action that the spider takes, or that the act of dancing to softly is what precipitates the unwinding? That is, it's kind of it's the result of the kind of joy of it that creates the unwinding of the yarn of pearl. It's almost peripheral, or the result of his joy.
Yeah,
I
think so. It sets in action this unwinding, the dancing. Like I press on my sewing machine and it starts.
Yeah, these are really fascinating questions. It's the other thing that strikes me about this is how much the spider, and you've all talked about this so eloquently, is identified as male, but is ultimately supplanted by the female. I mean, however one reads it, that his actions take place throughout the poem, and his plying, his dancing, his supplanting, but then by the very end, those continents of light create his boundaries, which are eliminated by the housewife, or by the housewife's broom.
Yeah, the broom.
Go back to gender that was mentioned from the very beginning. It's hard to ignore gender in there.
But it is interesting that Dickinson, as a woman, would gender the spider male, since she's so very clearly on the spider side, as it were, or sympathizing with this beautiful creativity.
Yeah,
even
I was
though,
going to say that, but
go
whether
ahead, go
there's
ahead.
there's like a critique at the same time. Again, totally agreeing with you about the fact that actually, I mean, all this work, all this creation is just destroyed all of a sudden by something very mundane. I mean,
Yeah.
the housewife doing something not necessarily agreeable, and there's a critique of the fact that the poetic or artistic creation is not being understood properly, or even ignored by the person who's not involved in such a poetic or creative action. So it's not being understood. All the work that's being done, all the effort is completely put aside, and it just becomes something that's not even intelligible. It's just something that we sweep, and it's not even there anymore. It's forgot. So there's this critique, I think, also. Writing as a poet, she wants to maybe the poetic work to be appreciated more. I mean, all the work being done, all the applying from knot to knot and just going, I mean, disappearing. I think it's really interesting, because I always read Dickinson as a poet writing about poetry, which makes her maybe like Hölderlin in a certain way. I mean, always writing about the essence of poetry or poetic creation or the creation itself. So this is how I read also. I mean, so I totally agree with Chris's interpretation about the fact that she's on the side of the spider, not the housewife.
Yeah, of course. This is again her scope. She has an enormous scope, and we're seeing it as God and the creator, and also ecologically. You can think of ecology also, that that the housewife is just man who makes things that destroy. That are just gone. So it is an enormous scope she again covers here. And the broom, all the tools we make just to destroy what is created. And I think it is so. What I find so fascinating about her poetry is that it seems to me a poetry for many centuries. It covers, it's timeless somehow.
And I would point us at there to Chris's note about this poem. So Chris, I'm pointing right back to your words in your notes about the spider as that culturally dominant motifs regarded the spider as noxious or demonic, as in Mary Howitt's nursery rhyme, The Spider and the Fly, or in Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And then you also make reference to Greek mythology, where Athena competes with the expert weaver Arachne to see who has the most skill, and when Arachne wins the contest, turns her into a spider.
Yeah.
And Dickinson knew her mythology, and she also knew the nursery rhyme and the sermon. And I mean, there are opportunities here to think about the spider not just as an artist, but as a much maligned creature artist in the dominant culture.
I had no idea I ever wrote that. So thank you for reminding me.
Well, I'm on page 760 of the volume.
The point.
Good.
And one does forget what one wrote. It does.
Yeah.
It does. Yes, I have been surprised by
I did
my
check
own
my
words from
footnote.
time to time.
One of the things that was mentioned earlier that we haven't talked much about, and I'm looking at the time here, we have about 14 more minutes, is musicality was mentioned, rhyme and rhythm as well. And Mark also pointed out how in Indonesian it looks very long, and there goes the meter. I don't know, Chris, if you had any questions or advice for us regarding those, rhyme, rhythm, meter. For myself, I looked at alliteration and I see how the sounds change because the wording is different. And
I guess this is not a poem that strikes me as much as some of her poems do as depending on a kind of alliteration or assonance all the way through the poem, although there are wonderful moments all the way through where you have alliteration and then only off rhymes, right? So slant rhymes, which is interesting. So even when she uses alternatives, the rhymes remain slant. I guess what really just what captures me, or has in the past captured me about this poem, are these metaphors. The spider is dancing and knitting and plying a trade and rearing supreme a continent of light. Wow, a spider web, a continent of light, or even in some ways, I don't know if it's more or less striking. The theory of light, I think continent is more striking. But
how is it a continent of light? I don't understand that one. It's
right.
a continent of light.
Tarek, do you want to take that? I have a response, but you're waving.
So sorry. I was just thinking of the web as a kind of this sort of global kind of continent or part of a map. But could I just add the other thing, when you're reading this in the fascicle, you can see that onto my books, So Good to Turn, which is a poem about reading and the inspiration of art. So it's very interesting that everything that you've all said today makes me think that the poems that she's chosen on that same sheet kind of interact, because she's also got He Found My Being, Set It Up, which kind of sounds like the kind of God idea that you were talking about earlier. So I just want to thank you for illuminating this poem, but also maybe some of the poems near it in the fascicle.
And I would add that light is in with the continent, in order for us to see a spider's web, it needs to be lit.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, the image reflects what would appear like a continent on a map. And the word continent, I checked the lexicon, did in not often used, did mean a large mass of something. Webster refers to it as obscure. So that continent of light, to me, is the way in which it becomes visible to us.
But also it makes me think of gender again.
Yeah.
The sun is he. So the sun, the light comes from the sun. And that also is male. So it's not in German,
necessarily.
In English,
it could be a candle.
Not necessarily. But I want to go back to what you said, Emily, about light. So in different lights, the spider web also looks different. So it can be really just incredibly sparkling, or it can be barely visible, or whatever it would be. So light.
But again, the grammatical connection there doesn't convince me, because it's off light. It's as if the continents are made of light rather than light enlightening the continents or making them visible.
But isn't that lovely to think that that tiny, slender silver webbing is like light itself? It's as though the spider is spinning light.
It's a beautiful image.
And of course, logically, we think no, it's the light that lets us see the web. But Dickinson is turning it around. It's as though the spider is spinning light, and it's wonderful to go back to that. Then, so the pearl. So the spider spins pearl. The spider spins light, and these are in such contrast to the notion of yarn. right? So the spider's doing something on the one hand very domestic, and on the other hand utterly extraordinary, right? Pearl, light.
I think it is wonderful that it is not completely explainable. That makes a poem.
Yeah.
There's Margaret Freeman when you need her to explain a cognitive reading.
Well, so Bruna, I think I talked over you when you were about to say something. Did you get your point in? Yeah.
I
Okay.
think, yeah.
Okay.
I
All right.
think, yeah.
Good.
And I was just looking at the poem, making sure we had made some notes with Axel, what we wanted to point out. Axel, I don't know if you want to add anything. I think we've covered many of the things that we had questions about, or that, and there's many more that came up in here in discussion about what translation choices need to be made in there.
No,
Well, I'm very glad you brought us back to Continents of Light, because it is really just a beautiful phrase and concept.
Yeah.
And maybe, also goes back in some ways to unperceived and unsubstantial. Right. So, light is one of those things that is present, but not substantial.
And I think, Axel, it was your idea to talk about God and the Creator, I think, and the light creates. Light is also something that is creating in itself.
So I always wonder when I'm thinking about the way Dickinson uses alternative words in our fascicles. So not the different versions that, when she's writing out a full separate copy of a poem and creates a different version, but when she's, writing alternative words onto the fascicle page, or, a sheet page or a piece of stationery, I'm always thinking, do I like the alternative better, or do I like the first word that she wrote down better? And, in our remaining 5 minutes, does anybody, does anybody want to say, oh yeah, I really like that alternative. That for me, is the word we should use or should be chosen, or.
I think the question, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I would ask the question more like, are we allowed to go for those preferences when there are alternative words that decisions haven't been made upon?
Yeah, that's also a great question, right? So is Dickinson giving us the, let's say, permission by putting those alternatives on the page for us to, make our own poem out of them, right? To say, yeah, I want to pick and choose here and there, right?
She cannot stop us anymore. So
right.
We have to take the responsibility ourselves. And I think especially here, it would be a completely different poem. So I cannot really say. I like it as it is, actually, very much.
Go ahead, Mark. We don't hear you. Can you please unmute yourself?
I didn't have the alternatives. And so I'm very happy when choices I made are very much like her alternatives.
You are absolved, perhaps not in a legal sense.
That are kind of halfway between the word on the page and the alternative that she proposed.
Okay.
I would prefer as he knits to instead of to himself.
As he knits.
Yeah.
And I have a question for Chris before we're approaching the end. So was the main reason why you suggested this poem, is it because you like it, or is it because you find it interesting?
Okay, so when I think about the poems I love, they're also the poems that I write about all the time. And so I thought I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to choose a poem that I've written about a lot, because I thought that would be less interesting for us as a group, and it would also be less interesting for me. So I wanted to choose a poem that I hadn't really myself thought through in minute particularity, but also one that seemed to me to raise both syntactic and metaphorical questions. And also I liked that there was just the one copy, but alternatives, so that so we wouldn't be caught in the in the discussion of, well, she sent it this way to Higginson and this way to Bowles and this way to somebody else, but instead, okay, this is the way she wrote it, copied into a fascicle, into what became a fascicle booklet, but then there are quite a number of alternatives. I once had a mathematician do the calculation for me of how many different versions of a poem there would be if you had X number of alternatives in Y number of lines, and it came out in the thousands. It was really because this word and then you take out and turn that one, the different ways that you match the words. So really, if we do have permission to put our own poems together, it could be it's not quite infinite, but there are a whole lot of ways one could imagine this poem. So yes, I like this poem very much, and I must say I like it even better after our conversation. So thank you to everyone for calling attention to all the things that make it lovely. Yeah, but I also thought it was interesting and not overdone, if you know what I mean. So it's a poem everybody knows, but it's not really just overly worked on.
I think it is really, if I think back on our talk now, it is a celebration of language again. And this continent of light that sticks in your mind, and maybe it changes language even, even that. So yeah, I'm very grateful too that I was able to listen here and take part.
As am I. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bruna and Axel, thank you for getting us together.
Actually, we should thank you for accepting to be here, and everybody else who participated. Thank you, Magda and Mark, for sending the versions and for sharing your languages here with us.
Thank you for letting us do
Thank
it.
you, everybody.
Also, I'm glad
really
to
enjoyed
know
this.
some
Sorry.
faces now.
Yes.
Felicia, were you saying something?
I was just thanking everybody. We ate and drank the precious words. And by the way, my name is Felicia Nimua. It's a double name. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Felicia.
Thank you.
Felicia
Nimue.
Nimua.
Thank you.
Right. Thank
Felicia Nimue.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
so much.
Okay. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
So when's the Axel and Bruna, when's the next workshop?
We'll send the note. There won't be one until the beginning of next year, but
Okay,
probably early spring. Is that right, Axel?
Yes, this is what we were saying, but we maybe if this was a success, maybe we should do it more often, but we should discuss this with Tarek also in terms of arranging, because there are other online workshops as well, so we don't want them to be so jammed all together. So we wanted to give some space between different events, but we would need to discuss this with Tarek again to see whether we can do something again.
That's why we decided there's something in November and there's something in December. So looking at what the schedule looks like.
Perfect. Right. That seems very smart and correct. I do think that a wonderful essay could be written out of the kinds of comments on translating and on, in this case, this particular poem, but, generally out of what happens in this kind of translation workshop and thinking about Dickinson. So
Dan asked us to send a piece for the bulletin, so we will send a description of what happened and mention some of the things were discussed, and he will publish the languages that were translated as well.
Yes, I like that very much, but I was actually thinking of even a longer piece.
A longer one. Okay.
Yeah. Good.
I will add that at the Poetry Symposium co-sponsored by ALA and the Society for the Study of American Poets in March, there will be 3 Dickinson panels, one of which will include a statistical analysis of Dickinson's use of alternates in her fascicles.
So did
So
you say 3 panels, not just 3 speakers, but 3 panels?
3 panels. We have
Wow.
9 papers.
Wow.
None of which are mine. I'm going to be talking about Jimmy Carter's poetry.
And I will be there talking about Marianne Moore.
Well, in that case, see you in Salem.
See you in Salem.
Where wit kitsch abounds. And if any of you are nearby, that symposium is at near the end of March. Is the 26th, well, the 27th, 28th, in Salem, Massachusetts. And it looks like it's going to be a humdinger, but Dickinson will be well represented.
That's great news. Thank you, Emily.
Okay.
By the way, this is much better than Discord, which caused a lot of discord for me. Much easier to get into. Thank you.
Yes, I thank you as well, and thank you to our host and guest speaker. I've quite enjoyed this.
Thank you.
It was
Limited as my language capabilities are.
Right, right. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night. Good day.